Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks to Secretary Rubin for the opening remarks. So the first panel of the day will focus on the topic of incarceration and sentencing reform. Secretary Rubin put this in the context of mass incarceration, which we have in the United States. We define that to be based on the fact that the rate of incarceration in the US is way off the charts as compared to comparable countries. And there seems to be a consensus at this moment of time among scholars and policymakers that perhaps we're not fighting crime as effectively as we could be with such a heavy reliance on incarceration. So the focus of the panel will be around a new proposal by Stephen Raphael and Michael Stoll. And to kick that off, Stephen will give us a brief overview of the main elements of their policy proposal.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So since the 1970s, the rate at which we incarcerate inmates in state and federal prison has increased almost fivefold. We now have a very high incarceration rate relative to our past selves, and we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Aside from having lots of people in prison, it's also the case that there are certain communities within the country that have very, very high incarceration rates, in particular African American communities, and then within demographic groups, African American males with relatively less education. And of course, associated with this large increase in incarceration are all of the collateral consequences associated with that. A large wake of people who are former prisoners, lots of families who have family members who have done time, and so on and so forth. It's interesting that in some communities, the ubiquity of incarceration is such that Sesame Street actually has a character on an Einstein set of tools that is meant to help children cope with an incarcerated family member. So for example, the Muppet online is supposed to be a child whose father is incarcerated and he's having a hard time in his absence and a hard time talking about it with friends. So it's sort of seeped into the mainstream in ways that perhaps was unthinkable in decades past. So why is it that we have so many Americans in prison? What happened? Why did we see this big increase over the last 30 years? Well, it turns out that the answer to that question is relatively simple. Relative to the past, we are much more likely today to punish people with prison than we were many years ago, especially for drug offenders. And it's that increase in extensivity contributes quite a bit to the growth in our incarcerated population. And aside from that extensiveness with which we use prison, when we send people to prison, we're more likely to keep them there for a long time. And that's especially true for violent offenders. So my colleague Michael Stoll and I have spent a lot of time trying to understand to what extent do various behavioral explanations of growth in incarceration, such as the crack epidemic or deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill or the weaker economy, are explaining prison growth. And basically our conclusion is that it's basically our policy choices, that we're choosing to sentence people to prison and where our sentences have become discretely much more harsh, and that's what explains what's happened. Now one might ask, what is it that we get from this in terms of benefits? It certainly is the case that when you incarcerate criminally active people, you prevent crime, and it can happen through several avenues, through incapacitating people that are criminally active and perhaps from deterring people who might commit crime in the absence of the threat of punishment. It turns out, however, that empirical research on this question strongly suggests that the marginal returns to additional increases in incarceration decline, and decline quite rapidly as scale increases. And that's due to a couple of different things. First of all, when we increase the liberalness with which we apply prison, in other words, we're applying it more extensively, we tend to net people that aren't as criminally active when they're not institutionalized, and it brings the average effectiveness of prison down and the marginal effectiveness even lower. Aside from that, when we send people to prison for a long time, we incarcerate people into age ranges where they're not really as criminally active as they once were. So it's a standard empirical result in criminology that offending declines quite rapidly with age. You can look within prisons and you'll see that if you look at institutional misconduct among inmates, that it declines quite rapidly with age for all offenses, serious and less serious. You take these two things together and basically what it means is we have kind of a classic case of diminishing marginal returns. I'm an economist, so I have to say something like that at least once. And it turns out that at least at the current levels in the United States, and perhaps we can talk about this more later, that the marginal benefits in terms of crime reduction are quite low, and there's room for reducing incarceration without having appreciable impacts on crime, especially if the resources are reinvested in other ways. So we have a proposal that's two-part. To encourage states and perhaps federal policy to scale back the use of incarceration in a way that we hope will use prison beds more smartly and reserve them for people where it'll actually have a crime-preventing effect. And the first thing we argue for is that there be more discretion afforded to certain actors in the criminal justice system in terms of deciding who to send to prison and how long they should be there. And we suggest two changes. One, we believe that states that have truth in sentencing provisions in their penal codes, which are basically provisions that require that certain offenders serve at least 85% of their sentences, that be revisited and perhaps either scaled back or abandoned. So there's quite excellent research that suggests that when parole is not a possibility, people don't engage in rehabilitative offending or in rehabilitative programming. They're more likely to recidivate when they're released, and also that there are people who are probably safe bets that aren't released when they can be. So we think that could be revised. Second, we believe that states should take inventory of and reevaluate legislative mandatory minimum sentences, which are basically written sentences that apply to specific offenses, and it applies to everyone regardless of criminal history and regardless of how they behave once they're incarcerated. In most instances, mandatory minimum sentences are written for offenses for which prison is already a possibility. And we believe that it unnecessarily ties the hands of judges and then on the release decision of parole boards in a way that creates inefficiency in the use of prison beds and exacerbates our over-incarceration. The second part of our proposal has more to do with the relationship between county and state governments. So in California, we've undergone a very big change where now the counties are much more responsible for criminal justice policy pertaining to felony offenders. And one of the things that was uncovered is there's enormous heterogeneity across counties in the degree to which they use prisons, with some counties incarcerating people at 5 times the rates of other counties. And it can't be explained by differences in demographics, can't be explained by differences in crime, it's just that some counties incarcerate a lot of people. And when you really think about the way things work in the criminal justice system, the counties prosecute and send people to prison, and then the state pays for it. So essentially the marginal cost in many instances to counties is 0 of sending someone to prison, while keeping the person in the county actually costs something. So we think that cost structure is wrong. And we propose several different strategies perhaps for creating a positive marginal cost for counties, some of which would hold county budgets constant and some which would actually charge them amount. But they're just different possibilities and they're examples across the state. So for example, one could imagine a per head tax to the county that increased as the severity of the offender decreased. Or alternatively, one could imagine providing block grants to the county of money for criminal justice expenditures, which is then reduced head for people that are sent to prison. Okay. Can I have one more minute? Is that okay? All right. The other is one could imagine a predetermined kind of band within which your county incarceration rate can fall. If you go above that band, the county could be taxed. If you come in below, the cost savings could be shared with the county. And these are just a couple of different ideas. Now, there is actually evidence of counties being responsive to these cost incentives. So for example, in 1995, California passed legislation that basically increased the per head tax for juveniles admitted to the California Youth Authority from some nominal amount to a quite substantial amount for less serious offenders. In fact, for the least serious offenders, counties had to pick up almost 100% of the bill. And as this graph is showing, what you see is admissions to the CYA plummet once the counties had to pay for part of it. So that makes a difference. Or just one further example, lots of states have experimented with cost sharing with adult probation, whereby if adult probation departments can reduce their revocation rate below some historical baseline, the savings associated with that in terms of fewer prison admissions is then shared with the county for criminal justice and rehabilitative expenditures. So there's lots of room for creativity here. So We believe there's room to reduce incarceration with impact and crime, and we just offer a few ideas, and hopefully we'll have more time to discuss in greater detail. Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
So we are thrilled to have a line of discussants with a range of experiences and perspectives. So to kick us off, I'm going to ask Cristine, who is Chief of Staff to the District Attorney in the City and County of San Francisco, to give us your reaction to this proposal as someone who's worked very closely with this issue in a very practical way. We all know about the overcrowding of prisons in California, and you've had to deal with this issue, as Stephen talked about. So what exactly is your experience in California in terms of how you went about doing this, and what are the results that you see on the ground?
Yeah, I think the paper is critical if we're going to talk about moving away from incarceration as our default setting in criminal justice. In our county in San Francisco, about 45% of our cases qualify under the realignment proposal. So nearly half of our caseload at any given time is people that they're on a nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offense case. You can then deduce from that what types of cases those are. When District Attorney Gascon came into office, a little over 60% of our caseload was dedicated to drug prosecutions. Over the years that he's been there, we've reduced that by about 30% and have decided that we want to focus our resources on the more serious and violent cases, the things you expect all of us to be doing as prosecutors, protecting you in your homes and in your bedrooms from a predator, but not so much prosecuting somebody that has a substance abuse issue. And what we've seen in that experiment, San Francisco already sends a very small amount of people to state prison, but we've reduced that even further as a result of these types of policies. And we're now asking ourselves the tough questions around who we're sending to county jail. So it does start to align the incentives in the right place. Well, we send about 10% of all of our convicted felons to state prison. That's exceptionally low, I think. The professors would tell you, and something that we're proud of in our office, that we don't use it as our first go-to place on our cases, rather as a backup. And when realignment passed, there was a question asked of all of us, and district attorneys around the state said, what kind of resources are coming with it? What are you going to ask for? How are you going to staff this new work? And what we decided to do with the resources that came into our county is we hired a social worker. We didn't hire any more attorneys. We decided we wanted somebody to help us figure out how to do the work slightly better. Having been an attorney myself in the courtroom, you're very good at persuading a jury and objecting to evidence and getting your point across and winning the argument. What you're quite terrible at is deciding what treatment program somebody might need or what type of mental health issues they might have. That was something I spent no time on in school and then was asked to be an expert on a daily basis, repeatedly, as people were coming across the threshold of the courtroom. And so what we did was we hired a social worker. We called him an alternative sentencing planner. And we told him, work on realignment cases, let the DAs come to you, don't force yourself on them. We didn't want organ rejection from our staff. And what we quickly learned was while the realignment cases were of interest, many more cases were of interest to our prosecutors. They wanted this type of a resource because there are so many difficult decisions they're making every single day that are outside of their academic wheelhouse that this became a critical resource. So we've had this person on staff now about 2 years. In the year and a half that I have data for you, he looked at about 300 cases. Of those, 89 have concluded and have been sentenced. On those 89 cases, when the cases originally came through, they were exposed to about 306 years in prison as a cumulative group. Our offers to them, the first time we decided what we thought the case was worth, were 96 years in prison. That would have been a cost of $5 million to the state. The alternative sentencing planner, social worker, got involved in those cases, and on the cases, we ended up with a total of 11 years of state prison rather than the 96. That costs about $570,000. So in just that very small experiment, you can see that we saved the state $4.5 million. We've now decided that this is a worthwhile effort and something we're going to continue to try to expand in our office. We have many more cases where this should be a service available to the attorneys. We just don't have the resources at the moment to do that. But you can imagine if you scale something like this and you go to a county like Los Angeles, where I used to practice, the enormity of the cases there, you would see dramatic savings to the state. And I think the question we're having now is how do we translate those savings to the county level? And how do we start to have the cost-shifting conversation around doing our work the right way? So rewarding prosecutors for the success of the individual once they leave our system, rather than how much we were able to extract from them when they came in.
So I'm going to follow up with you for a minute, because I think the obvious worry when we hear, okay, let's put fewer people behind bars, and you've managed to successfully do that in your county in a way such that you say, okay, there's a set of people for a set of crimes that we were sending to prison, and there's a better way to treat those people, right? But the worry is, well, if those alternative ways don't work, I mean, to the same way as just having them off the streets do, there's going to be an increase in crime, right? So we can't just open the doors and have an increase in crime, even if it does save the county, save the state money. So, you know, having nothing to do with this panel, I just happened to be out in California a couple weeks ago, and I was sitting with a group of professors, and at lunch, the lunchtime conversation moves to, you know, in California, we had overcrowding of prisons. We're not putting as many people in prison anymore. And the rate of break-ins in our neighborhood has just gone up. And the word is out that unless you commit a violent offense, you're not going to prison. So this, you know, these are just people talking at lunch, not about policy, just saying this is what's going on in our neighborhood. Everyone's getting broken in. What's your response to that?
The data just doesn't bear that. The program I just talked about where we have the social worker engaged, we've seen a 7% reduction in recidivism of the people that we gave reduced prison sentence to. So I expect that that will continue to bear results. But even if you look at the numbers on a statewide basis, which is discussed in the paper, you'll see that there's zero increase in violent crime, which I would posit is what all of us care most about. And there's only a very nominal increase in auto-related thefts, breaking into a car to steal the change in the ashtray or the radio or to steal the vehicle. And that even, very, very minor. And we're now 3 years into this, so it's not as if, you know, it's 6 months in, we just can't tell what people are going to do. Many people have been released from prison. Many people have been given a sentence at the county level and released from county jail and returned to society. So that increase is so nominal, and I would posit not enough to make, shouldn't be enough for us to turn back on what seems to be working in all other respects.
Can I add just a thought too? We did an evaluation of crime trends in California, and as we said, our estimate is maybe an additional property crime, motor vehicle theft per year not served. There was a similar large decrease in Italy in 2006 associated with the collective clemency. And the drop is kind of comparable in magnitude to what happened in California. And you see a very big spike in crime, on the order of 18 felonies per year not served of the people that are released. So it's a fairly sizable impact. The difference is in Italy, the incarceration rate inclusive of jails before their collective pardon in 2006 was about 103 per 100,000. In California, when you add the jail population, it's almost 700 plus per 100,000. So it's a 7 times difference. And so when we're coming from such a high base, we have a lot more to work with in terms of who's going to be let out, and it shows in the evaluation.
I mean, like the marginal person in jail in California is less likely to be a
Yes.
repeat offender or violent offender. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Professor Daniel Nagin. And you've written a lot about policing and deterrence. And of course, one of the reasons we rely on our prisons is not just to punish people, but to deter crime. So I'm interested in hearing from you to the extent to which you think where we are in our rates of incarceration is an effective place to be in terms of deterring crime, and if there are more effective ways to do that.
Sure. If you don't mind, I have some remarks written out. I'm less confident than Cristine to talk extemporaneously, so I'll
more jury trials.
Actually, I'm here in two capacities. One is, as Melissa said, in my capacity as an individual researcher, like Michael and Steve, does a lot of research on crime policy. The second is as a representative of the National Research Council's Committee on the Causes and Consequences of High Incarceration Rates. That committee was chaired by Jeremy Travis, who's the president of John Jay College, and its vice chair was Bruce Western of Harvard University. And the report was released yesterday at just about this time. So let me begin with my bottom line. The conclusions about the causes and consequences of high incarceration rates in the U.S. that were reached by Michael and Steve closely correspond, I would say eerily closely correspond with the conclusions of the committee. They also closely square with my own conclusions, particularly as they pertain to ways to control crime policy, as the ways crime control policy should change in the United States. For 2 decades, particularly for violent crime, we've had a declining crime rates in the United States. And for an even longer time, 4 decades, prison populations have been rising throughout the country. We have now 1% of the adult population is behind bars. Across the political spectrum, there's a recognition that the social and economic costs of incarceration, at least at its present scale, are not affordable. Can we reduce incarceration rates without triggering more crime? Here, I'm a little bit less sanguine than perhaps some people here. I do think the answer is yes, but only if we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. More than 250 years ago, Cesare Beccaria, an Italian philosopher and politician who wrote extensively on crime, admonished that it is better to prevent crimes than punish them. But the U.S. response to rising crime rates from the 1960s to the 1980s was predicated on 2 faulty premises that ignored Beccaria's warning. The first was that the police were impotent to prevent crime, and the second was that sending more people to prison for longer periods of time was an effective and efficient way to prevent crime, to prevent crime. Conventional wisdom is that the certainty of punishment, not its severity, is a more effective deterrent. Evidence, though, gives us the correct form of the certainty principle, and that is that the certainty of apprehension, not the severity of the ensuing consequence, is the effective deterrent. This conclusion has 2 important implications. First, it makes clear the fallacy of claims that punishments like mandatory minimum sentencing deter crime. There's simply no evidence that increasing the risk of imprisonment post-apprehension and conviction serves as a deterrent. Likewise, there is good evidence that lengthy sentences are ineffective in deterring crime and are not efficient ways of preventing crime by incapacitation for precisely the reasons that Steve laid out. So like with Raphael and Stolz, the report of the committee affirms these conclusions. In my own view, now is that mandatory minimum sentences need to be repealed and sentence lengths reduced to reduce prison populations. Second, the revised certainty principle places effective use and deployment of the police at center stage in deterring crime. There is much evidence that proactive policing methods, such as focusing police presence in crime hotspots, is effective in preventing crime, not just displacing it. As we scale back prison populations, it's important that we make more effective use of the police in ways that provide for safety in a democratic society, not a safe police state. Proactive policing tactics have potential negative consequences. Stop, question, and frisk, for example, has been the source of enormous controversy, not only in New York City, but also in other places around the world, largely because the police are stopping, questioning, and frisking. The people they're stopping are often young minority men. Is SQF effective in reducing crime? Evidence to answer this question is scant, but evidence leads us to see that that's the wrong question anyway. The right question that we should ask is stop, question, and frisk more effective than other forms of proactive policing in preventing crime? There are good reasons for deep skepticism about the relative effectiveness of SQF, at least as it's practiced in New York. First, police effectiveness in responding to crime rests heavily on the willingness of citizens to report crimes and identify perpetrators. Policing tactics that alienate communities reduce the willingness of its citizens to cooperate with the police. Second, SQFs produce far too many arrests for minor offenses, such as possessions of small amounts of marijuana. These arrests clog the court system with trivial cases, and they also needlessly scar the records of those who are arrested, limiting their future employability and exposing them to increased legal risk. Proactive policing methods such as SQF need to have less noxious effects on communities. This requires that officers receive proper training in how to do SQFs in ways that are respectful and minimize their impact if no weapon is found. SQFs have to be done within the parameters of the law. There has to be an articulable suspicion that the individual has a weapon, and the individual should be given the reasons why the stop and frisk was done. Police also need to spend time explaining their initiatives to the community, telling them what they're doing and why. In 2003, Supreme Court Justice Kennedy made the following observation about imprisonment rates in the US. Our resources are misspent, our punishments too severe, and our sentences too long. Last fall, Attorney General Holder observed, too many Americans go to too many prisons for far too long for no good law enforcement reason. They're right. We need to implement the policy changes laid out in the Raphael and Stoltz report and the NRC committee report. To that, I would only add that in parallel, there needs to be a national effort to bring greater use of police to prevent crime in a fashion that provides for public safety in a democratic society, not a police state.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to Michael Stoll as one of the authors of this proposal. I think Dan's given us a lot to respond to here. In particular, let's say we're successful getting your proposal out there and states adopt it and reform their sentencing and fewer people are sent to prisons. What is the alternative that you're proposing states should rely on to keep the crime rates down?
And what we propose is not inconsistent with what Dan just said. Again, we are proposing to use prison beds for only those that pose the greatest risk to society. In doing so, we could lower the incarceration rate without appreciably affecting crime. But in doing so, we believe that there's also budgetary savings, especially at the state level, with which we could do other kinds of compensatory social investments to crime fight as well. This was, I think, echoed in the report recently released by the Urban Institute as part of the Justice Reinvestment Initiative set of points, too, about using savings smartly to do other kind of crime fighting. So what kind of alternative crime fighting could we do? Well, first, we could look at the criminal justice system itself, in particular at parole and probation, and to make those enterprises much more effective in reducing recidivism. One of the big ideas in that field now has been generated by my colleague at UCLA named Mark Kleiman, who has proposed this idea that Dan just talked about swift and certain punishment, and that if there's greater coordination between criminal justice, between probation and parole, and the police, in identifying and bringing those that violate the terms of their parole or probation quickly to the courts to be sanctioned, that seems to change their behavior relatively quickly. And if it doesn't, sanctions that increase in its punitiveness seem to have that effect too in reducing recidivism and helping probationers and parolees make smarter decisions. So that seems to be a particularly fruitful role. But looking at how we do business in the juvenile courts also matters too. There's a pretty important study by Azer and Doyle that suggests that for the most hard to serve men who are first-time offenders, when they've been randomly assigned to a set of judges, those boys that were sentenced to detention ended up not graduating from high school less often and going into adult prison at a much higher rate than those that weren't sentenced to detention. And this is a random assignment, which says that the youth authority or prison itself has a criminogenic effect.
As compared to the kids who do similar stuff.
Exactly. These are the same hard-to-serve boys. Some are sentenced to prison or detention, and some aren't. And those that went and did time had the outcomes that I talked about. So detention in prison itself could have criminogenic effects that are, I think, counter to the sort of social mission of why we're using prison to control crime. So how can we divert? Well, one of the ideas about diverting hard-to-serve kids, I think, is going to be proposed by Jens and Anuj later today, where behavioral modification for those in high-risk groups and changing the risk-reward and the time dimensions of their decisions, I think, has promising results. But that's for those that are involved in crime. But the big question is, how do we deter people from crime? And I think Dan did talk about the idea that police staffing levels matter a lot. The best empirical evidence by Levitt and others from the University of Chicago suggests that higher levels of staffing per set of residents in a locale does have tremendous crime-fighting effects, but it says nothing about the kind of policing, right? And I think hopefully we're past the point where we are proposing stop and frisk in New York or in Los Angeles, benign neglect and then forced response when a crime is reported, and that we move more towards community-type policing, for lack of a better term, where police agencies are heavily involved in the social fabric of a community and build social capital, particularly with institutions and residents in vulnerable communities. That seems to have powerful effects. When we look at the institution of some form of community policing in Boston and New York and in Los Angeles in the early 2000 period, we see tremendous declines in crime above and beyond what other big cities had experienced, to suggest that the kind of policing that one does too. But the emergence of smart policing also matters too. So the use of geographic information systems, the use of new theories of deterrence, such as concentrated deterrence, which Dan talked about, all those seem to be new ways that we could smartly and humanely police in ways that achieve, I think, what we're trying to achieve, which is low crime, but I'll also have the collateral cost of lost faith in some of our institutions. So that's on the criminal justice side. But we could do things outside the criminal justice side too. And one of the big, I think, ideas that many states are flirting with is the idea of universal PK. So the benefit cost in crime reduction for those are tremendous. So having early investments in high quality education for kids matters, which also suggests that being in school matters too. And there's a lot of good evidence that after school programs, after school is when the time period within which juveniles are more likely to commit crime, particularly when they have little to do. So having effective after-school programs, have effective programs that keep kids in school, all of these have shown to have high benefit per cost with respect to crime fighting, and much bigger than the benefit cost of prison, even with moderate incarceration rate.
Great. So
regimes.
there's a lot of what you mentioned that I want to come back to. In particular, you know, there's two different motivations floating around here. One is perhaps our heavy use of incarceration is not the most effective crime-fighting tool, but you've also raised the possibility that, in fact, it has costs, right? So the example of kids being sent to detention, that's actually bad for them. So I want to come back to that. But before I do, I want to get a police viewpoint here. So we have, you know, we're going to rely heavily on the police. You've mentioned community policing. So Police Chief Dean Esserman, New Haven, you implemented community policing in the early 90s. What's your reaction to all of this?
My first reaction is I found the people who are going to fight for my budget at the City Board of Alders, and we'll be inviting you to speak for the police budget. And I want to thank Secretary Rubin for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. And I was thinking that in the 1967 year, the President of the United States, President Johnson, convened a commission, Crime in a Free Society. It was a seminal presidential commission. And in those 2 years, that report that was generated in '69, the opening line was, "There's too much crime for the health of the nation." And all these years later, I'm sitting in the nation's capital, and the conversation is there too many prisons and prisoners for the health of the nation? We have come a long way. And I don't know if any police chiefs were part of that commission, but many of us studied it. So here we are all these years later, and I think about that. And I think about what I've heard. Policing has changed. Policing has become a more thoughtful and engaged profession once isolated, so that I feel I'm in good company here. And I'm not sure that many police chiefs of the cities across the country would be disagreeing with what they heard. I'll comment for a minute. I'll tell two stories, because I love to tell stories, because I've been told so many.
People like police stories.
Yeah. And they're not about me, so they're good ones. The first is the story of, a young police officer joins the job, comes out of the academy, they're on their beat, and I've returned to New Haven as chief after 2 decades. I was there in the early 90s when we built the community policing program, and I was brought back to rebuild it 2 years ago. And we are the last city in the nation that I know of that we've recommitted to community policing in such a way that when you graduate the police academy, and it doesn't matter who you are or what your last name is, even Esserman, you walk a beat for the first year of your life before you go in a police car. Everyone, without exception, adopts a beat and walks it for the first year of their life to build relationships and perhaps to build humility. A commodity that is lost with the power of the police shield, yes? So the first story is a young officer is walking their beat, and they're looking great. They still fit into that uniform, a memory I have lost long ago. And they get their first big arrest. They chase the guy, and they get him. And, you know, broke into a car, robbed an old lady, got caught jumping out of a house, you name it, the real deal. Feels like $1 million, got the handcuffs on him, brings him into the station, brings him upstairs to detectives to prosecute, excuse me, we do still defer to prosecutors, to process, not prosecute. And they're snickering, the cops, the old detectives, and he's looking, you know, did he scuff his Buster Browns? Is his shirt pulled out? Did he tear his pants? You know, why are the old guys laughing at him when he's processing this prisoner? And finally, some old detective condescends to actually speak to a rookie and says those famous words to break the ice. Rookie is such an asshole. And, you know, you're not sure how to react to that as a rookie. You're often called that as a new chief as well, so I know those words. And they go, what are you trying to prove, kid? What are you running after this guy for? What are you wasting all your effort for? We just had him in here last week arresting him. And for that moment, this young rookie who thought they were changing the world meets the world of police cynicism as their expectation collides with the reality that they will spend their career rearresting the same people forever. And that in fact, whether it's a narcotics arrest and prosecution and incarceration or another, the #1 arrest in America is a rearrest, is arresting someone again that you've arrested before. If this was a panel on corrections, the #1 incarceration in America is a reincarceration, right? I went to Dartmouth and now I have an adjunct, only adjunct, they remind me, faculty appointment at Yale Law School. And the Alumni Association is nothing compared to the Prison Alumni Association, right? It is a powerful alumni organization in prisons that keep on coming back their entire life. So the first story is about the young officer who meets this enormous cynicism and unfortunately and often embraces it. And what is the reaction when expectation collides with reality? It's often fury, real anger. You don't believe in what you're doing anymore. Sometimes you take justice into your own hands. Sometimes you create a parallel justice system, or you just stay cynical. A lot of wonderful things happen too, because to see us involved in enforcement of the law is really to miss the point of what police spend most of their lives doing. I've been in uniform for a lot of years. Like Mr. Rubin said, 4 cities I've been a police chief in America for 22 years. I've never shot anybody. But these hands have delivered 8 babies, because that's what they needed the police to do those 8 nights. So we have a different relationship than people think. But part of it is intimate, even intimate with the people we arrest. So the first story is about that young cop who seems to think they are changing the world with an arrest, with the old cynics upstairs laughing at him that he just arrested and processing someone who they had arrested and processed last week. The second story is more personal. My oldest graduated college and got a job, and I'm an honest police chief, so I couldn't afford to buy him a car for graduation. So I bought him a bicycle. He moved here for a little while, and the third or fourth week, someone clipped the chain on his bike and stole it on the banister, the apartment he was living in. Who do you think's the first person my son called?
You?
Called his dad, 1,000 miles away across how many states? Now, why do you think that if the son of an American police chief wouldn't have an instinct to call 911, anyone else would? Why? So my son called his dad. And do you think my instinct was quickly hang up the phone and call 911 because I want my friend Kathy Lanier, the chief here, to have a courteous telephone response, a prompt police response, a good police report so that they can have good crime data to do good predictive policing because they'll pick up good crime patterns? Not the last thing on my mind. I said, don't worry about it. You okay? Yeah, we'll take care of it. Another unreported crime on the streets of Washington, D.C. But if you think about it, he did report it, right? He reported to someone he knew. And that is what has revolutionized thinking about American policing. The birth of community policing was a realization that we had become strangers in the community. And what I have learned through these old eyes over all these years is that none of us are strangers in the criminal justice system. The police know the prosecutors, and the prosecutors know the police. The corrections officers know the judges, and the judges know the cops, and we all know each other. And we all know our clients. There's little stranger relationships. We know the people we've arrested before we've arrested them, after we've arrested them, and long after they go away and come back. We know each other well. And in the community policing birth, we realized the consequence in a postmodern era of police moving into police cars with radios and 911 systems being born. And the first contract with America was not coined here in Washington, D.C. The first contract with America was a contract between the police and the citizenry. You call, we come. 911. Citizens step back and let us do it. Turns out we forgot to get to know each other anymore. So, what have we learned, and how would American police chiefs respond? Well, it's easier responding out of uniform, out of my jurisdiction, far away from New Haven today. But I think most police chiefs of the cities across the country would actually be receptive to what they're hearing today and not oppositional. That you just need a couple of years doing the work to hear that the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. And I think the great chasm is the world of rhetoric and what we hear. And on the other side of that abyss is the world of reality and what we know. I think the people on this panel are speaking truth. They're speaking what we know. And what we know is that we touch all too many people. We touch them all too often. And we touch them all too hurtfully. And that we need to understand that. Perhaps we need to touch less. Perhaps we need to know that prison isn't the only resort. And that we need to act on what we know instead of what we hear. Thank you.
So I'm going to respond in a way that now is going to, I'm almost thinking is cynical, which is a bit weird for me because I'm really not a cynical person at all. But you're saying...
Become a cop.
I mean, so I'm hearing, okay, you keep picking up the same guys. You keep picking up the same guys. And so how come my reaction isn't, gosh, it's not that we're putting too many people in jail, because this guy keeps doing the same thing on the street. Maybe we're just not doing a good job with them when they're in jail.
We're not.
So does that call for sentencing reform or prison reform?
That's a good question. I think it calls for both. I think that, I didn't learn as a lawyer and as a police chief what works in punishment. I learned it as a parent. Swift, certain, and short. There's nothing swift, there's nothing certain, there's nothing short about punishment in America. When we discipline our children at home, it's not weeks locked in your bedroom. And it's not take a reservation and we're going to address this punishment 9 months after you dropped your fork in the dining room or forgot to do your homework. But that's how we punish, right? But there's also, in my feeling, I have no problem putting people in prison. I've put a lot in prison. And maybe, I tell clergy who I work with very closely that I believe in a ministry, but some people need a prison ministry. But maybe I'm up here today, maybe Secretary Rubin really brought me up here to do my penance. So maybe what I've learned over these years is that most everyone that I've sent away comes back worse. Prison doesn't just chain the body, it chains the mind. You don't come back better, but you keep on coming back and back and back. It's not right that we've coined it for Americans, the Department of Correction, because nobody's getting corrected. Their anecdotes are few and far between, and so we make TV movies about it, because it's that unusual. For the most part, it's a destructive place. So I think you have to spend a life in the business like I have to see the results, to be open to accept failure and say, you're craving ideas, you're looking, you want to hear, even at the peril of your own job. At the risk of your own job, you are willing to listen to other ideas. And I've been persuaded.
I appreciate that so much, Chief. And the district attorney in San Francisco is a former police chief and colleague of this chief, and they share a lot in common. And one of the things that he talks a lot about is the system we have is not sustainable, right? We're learning that. The paper says that. We can't afford economically what we're doing, and socially we could really never afford what we've been doing. And we're now starting, I hope, to understand that as a society. And so the question is then what replaces that, right? Because you do still need an accountability matrix. There are people that step over the line. There has to be some response to that, presumably. One of the things that we're learning from policing, because for those of you not in criminal justice, unfortunately, prosecution is far behind policing in terms of using data or looking for new ideas for how we do our work. And one of the concepts we're exploring, because I believe this conversation goes beyond just incarceration, but the whole criminal justice process, I think, is harmful. And so even if we decide we're going to start to abandon prison for those that don't require that, what does the rest of the court system and the criminal justice process look like if we're moving towards doing this work better? And one of the things we've started doing is letting the community hear some of our cases rather than having ourselves proceed over those proceedings. So we go out into the community and we do night court. We train community members. They can be merchants, they can be students, they could be homemakers. We train them in the ideas of restorative justice and how to facilitate a hearing. And it's not a fact-finding hearing. The individual that has to go because they're accepting that, in fact, they did steal the bologna or break the window. But what the process is about the community saying, that's harmful to us. We don't like it when you do that. And here's what we want you to do to make that better. Those hearings happen within 2 weeks of the crime, and they happen at 1/3 of the cost of what it takes for us to go through the process in the courtroom to get to a relatively similar result. They happen pre-charging, so the individual doesn't end up with a criminal record as a result of going through this process. So if it's somebody that stepped over the line for the first time, no harm, no foul. You no longer have to declare the broken window as a misdeed you did in your 20s and have to account for it every time you apply for a job. And these types of systems are more sustainable, right? When we strengthen a community to resolve its own problems, we get much more mileage out of that than when we do with more of a stranger model where we say we're going to abdicate the responsibility for that and let somebody else decide who's good and who's bad in our neighborhood. Most people already know that. And so for those lower level cases, we've been able to do that. And I think we need to continue to iterate and explore in that space. What does that look like with a more serious case? We're doing that in the juvenile context with more serious cases. But I think there are a lot of opportunities here to draw on the strengths of community rather than relying on the criminal justice system to start to solve these problems. We have a waiting list for people wanting to be adjudicators because everybody feels they want to engage in that process. That's exciting to them. I could respond to a guy that tagged the wall on my store. I'm thrilled about that. And the outcome could be that he goes and works in a nonprofit that teaches young people how to paint murals. I feel really good about that. He's going to repaint the wall, make a letter of apology to the owner of the store, and they now have a relationship that's built on a positive experience instead of a negative one where they're both faulting each other for what happened in that process. Those are good outcomes, and I think those start to reduce the reliance on not just police, but on prosecutors and on prisons, and I think those are the kinds of conversations we as a country need to be having.
All right, you know what? We have some questions that have come in over Twitter, so I'm going to pose these. Crime used to be much worse in our country. Are the panelists concerned that if sentencing reform happens, we'll go back to the high crime rates of past decades? Get Dan and then Steve.
Yeah, let me respond to that. It's important, it is very important to understand that the imprisonment rate is not a policy variable per se. It's actually the outcome of policies about who we decide to send to prison and for how long. And those policies, the impact of those policies are different. They're heterogeneous. They're more or less effective. And we know now that certain policies related to mandatory minimum sentencing and lengthy prison sentences that are used just applied widely, not selectively, that we know that those are ineffective or efficient ways to prevent crime. And so those are the things that we need to go at correcting. And unfortunately, I think that there's not yet the political will to do that. There's some promising steps. And then, I would just also say, returning to my point about policing and the point that was made about, touching, the key here is not so much necessarily needing more police, although I'll come and to testify to that. It's how they're used, okay? And being used and mobilized in a way that prevents crime. And sometimes that will necessarily require police to make arrests. There are bad guys out there that have to be arrested. But more generally is thinking about metrics that measure police effectiveness all the way down to the officer level on ways that you can judge how successful they are in preventing crime, not just making arrests.
Steve.
So just to speak specifically to this crime issue, it is the case that you can find fairly large effects of increases in incarceration on crime in the United States during the 70s and 80s. The increases since the 90s have been considerably less effective. And there are lots of, actually growing numbers of examples where we've seen large declines in incarceration without corresponding increases. So to return to California, we had a realignment reform which has reduced our prison population from 161,000 by roughly 27,000 people. A third of those people are in county jail, so it was offset to a certain degree, but there's a lot more people on the street. If we look at the incarceration rate today in California, it's where it was before we passed 3 strikes in '94, and our crime rate is basically not that much higher. There's a little bit of impact of property crime, but we have very low crime rates historically. Texas has brought down its prison population from over 700 per 100,000 to 600 per 100,000, has not experienced the crime increase. New York has drawn down its prison population to below 300 per 100,000 and has not experienced a big crime increase. So, and that's not to say that the people in prison are not criminally active. Of course, many of them are. But when we're incarcerating at such a large scale, there's room to do other things, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity among people at due time, and not everybody is a highly criminally active person.
I think the other point to make is that, as Steve and I have been arguing, there's a diminishing benefit to incarceration, and we hire your incarceration rate, but there's tremendous, not only direct costs, but there's collateral costs,
Right.
all of which were highlighted in the National Academy of Sciences report. But I think the other point to make is that
Can you just, again, what's the evidence really, just stipulate for the crowd, what do we know about the collateral costs?
well, they're on families and communities. There's a good body of research that says, particularly in disadvantaged communities, that when you incarcerate males in the community above a certain percentage, that actually further destabilizes the neighborhood rather than make it more secure. There's good evidence that having an incarcerated parent lowers income, that lowers the quality of parenting for kids in families with an incarcerated parent. There's the direct collateral costs on those with records with respect to their inability to find work quickly and earn living in order to achieve whatever their goals are. There's direct collateral consequence on voting and other kinds of civil rights infringements. Most states ban those with records from being able to take social welfare programs or for getting low-income housing assistance. Most ban those from voting that had tremendous consequences on electoral outcomes. So there's a whole host, there's effects on health. So there's a whole host of collateral consequences that aren't measured by the direct cost of incarceration and imprisonment itself, that society, meaning all of us, are paying for from our mass incarceration policy, right? So I think that's the other point to make. But I also think that there's a benefit cost trade-off that we're making, just like we make with other kind of public policy decisions. So in our analysis, by selectively reducing incarceration, we don't find that there'll be big effects on violent crime, maybe some on property crime, but is society willing to trade that off for the lower collateral consequence of not having mass incarceration in the United States? I mean, we consciously decide, for example, to raise the miles per hour from 55 to 65, knowing that that has a direct cost on deaths from vehicle accidents. Now that's been reduced because of the improved safety of cars, but we still have that. But society's saying we're willing to trade that off for the benefit of increased commute or decreased commute times to work and other kinds of benefits from travel. So society's making these choices all the time, and we think that posing in this way, I think there'll probably be more buy-in that we could selectively, smartly reduce incarceration to get these benefits without having the same costs.
Great. All right, so we have a lot of questions coming in. A few of them are about the role of for-profit prisons in the prison industrial complex, which I now know is a thing, having worked on this for a few weeks. What do you have to say about this? What's the role of the prison industrial complex here?
Let me just make first of a comment on that, and actually Steve is probably more of an expert on this than I. It's important to keep in mind that these for-profit prisons represent a very small fraction of the total number of prisoners, and they certainly have a financial interest in this, and by all reports lobby, to protect those interests. But it's also the case that there are political interests, in the state systems. My understanding is in California that the guards and union is among the most powerful going, and in politicians who represent rural communities where there are prisons and they're one of the big employers, they also have a stake in it. So, but the point is that there are large numbers of people who have a financial stake in this scale of imprisonment, and trying to rationally bring this down is going to have to deal with the politics of that.
I would add, so it is a small percentage of inmates are housed in private prisons. Some states it's actually fairly sizable. And there certainly are constituencies. Any set of practice generates constituencies. But I think the prime sort of set of policy choices that have put us where we are today were kind of our own doing. And then now we've created beneficiaries and we have inertia associated with it and resistance. But I don't think that should be an insurmountable goal to thinking through corrections reform and sentencing reform.
Great.
I just want to add on to that. I get against the sense that's motivating that question, and I would ask people that put their focus there, to look at the perverse incentives in our government system.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point of the paper here, is that we have multiple incentives to send people to state prison at the county level, because as the paper points out, for myself as a local prosecutor, if somebody crosses my path and I can send them to state prison, the state pays that bill. My county doesn't pay that bill. That doesn't come out of my budget or my county's budget. And then somebody that we see as a potential problem for us as a community and a society is now the state's problem, is no longer our problem. So it's actually a very economic choice to make, right? To say, I'd rather push that cost onto somebody else. And what the paper is talking about is trying to align the costs with that decision, right? So that when I send somebody to prison, I pay for that. My county pays for that. So that I only send the people that I really believe that cost is warranted. And until you do that, you're not going to.
So we wouldn't want you to have to pay if somebody committed a heinous crime, but if there's a wobbler.
Right.
Right.
I'm going to just make a point, a very, very important point that Michael and Stephen make in their book and this paper, is that to understand that this rise in prison population was mostly having to do with policy choices. And the reason I emphasize that is if the policy choices were made that resulted in this increases, there can be selective policy choices made, particularly with regard to the kinds of sentences and so forth, that we know are ineffective, that we need to begin undoing them. That's a policy choice as well.
So we have time for one final question. I'm going to have to ask you to be brief in your response. It's a very specific policy question. Could the Californians comment on the appropriate role of the state in a realigned system in terms of oversight, funding, and system performance? We got 3 Californians.
I'll offer some. So the realignment has transferred money to the counties and has given the counties pretty great discretion in terms of how they're going to run their system. So there are counties that are emphasizing rehabilitation, and there are counties that are emphasizing incapacitation in the jails. And my read on the subject is, there was a lot more resistance at first, but there's more we can work with this, especially given that there's resources and we can do the job. And of course, counties differ according to their political philosophies. It's still a work in progress. There's efforts, particularly by the Public Policy Institute of California, to try to see what the counties are doing and see what's working. But the counties are talking to one another. And one interesting thing is that through these reentry councils, all the different sort of agencies within local criminal justice are probably talking to each other at levels that wasn't happening before this reform.
Great. All right, so we'll end on that, and let's thank our authors and our panelists for a very important discussion.